I was in South America.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you have a good time?
Sort of. It was very busy. I was doing mostly talks.
Oh.
All right. We are looking at the emotionality of William Butler Yeats, who was a Nobel Prize-winning poet. And we want to think about poets. Now, probably the most important things for a poet to have are intuition and insight. But that's not always what we think about. We have these notions about all artists, poets included, that they're very colorful, emotional people, and that there's plenty of excitement in them. And on the other hand, some poets we think of as being academic poets, sort of dull pedants who cleverly work with words but aren't really insightful. Now, both of these are extremes. And there are, of course, poets of either ilk. Of the former, we could probably look at Bukowski, and of the latter, we could probably look at somebody like T.S. Eliot, who was very pedantic about all of his poetry. Words are an extremely valuable tool to a poet, but they're only important if they carry a feel for life, or if they carry a feel for the insight that the poet is trying to make. And so it is very much a world of feeling. Now, if there's a flurry of emotion, it's exciting, but it may not be able to be the burden of meaning for a poetic image, so it can't be just excitement. So we want to understand what the emotionality of a great poet is like and how those emotions function in the work. Let's begin by looking at Venus, because Venus is one of the major contributors to the desire nature, and it's usually the most important planet in the conception that someone has of beauty. Venus in this case is in the third house, and that indicates opportunities to express beauty or to express loving feelings. But the quality of a planet is much more determined by the sign position than by the house position. Venus is in Taurus, and that indicates an appreciation of beauty that is rich and sumptuous, whether it is about physical things or whether it is about intellectual things. Taurus is a sign that appreciates richness and quality and opulence and all of that kind of thing. And that was certainly true of him. If you look at all of his poems, he never wrote about anything trite or anything trivial. He wrote primarily things of substance, and even if he was describing interactions between people, they were substantial. Taurus is the sign of stuff or of substance, of the composition of stuff, or the texture or the nature of stuff. Now, normally, the stuff of poetry is words. Poets do go into the meaning of words. That's the most common thing that they do. They go into the context of words and the nuance of words and things like that. And normally poets are very careful about words. Now, you can't say that Yeats' choice of words was careless. It was exquisite. And it was not only so because of the connotations that it carried, but he selected his words exquisitely in another way. he chose his words according to sound. Not only for their individual sounds, but for their aggregate sounds. So he was writing in the tradition of Celtic poetry, which was sung or chanted or something like that. And almost all of his poems can indeed be sung or chanted if you have a strong enough mind to hold it all together and chant at the same time. I can hardly even read them, they're so difficult. I have heard recordings of Yeats reading his own poetry, and it's an eerie experience because as he reads them, he does sort of sing or chant them, and you're transported into a very different world. And it's a world of poetry where you feel the poetry. And it's not just where you get an intellectual insight or a spiritual insight. There's a whole feeling of the chanting that is going on. Now, from this element in his desire nature, we can see that with Venus in Taurus, he liked regularity. He liked rhythmic things. Venus is one of the signs of singing. Both of the Taurus is one of the signs of singing, and Taurus and Libra are the most sonorous signs of the zodiac in that way. Now, with this position of Venus in Taurus, you can say that he has a bedrock emotional foundation. It's, he's very stable. That is, at least in his attractive emotionality. He liked steady, basic emotions, almost like the rock castles that he liked to live in. He liked to live in these Irish solid rock castles that they put together. He appreciated substantial things and he appreciated rich things, but he wasn't extravagant. Or he wasn't indulgent. Jupiter or any other planet that is extravagant is not involved with Venus. And on top of that, Venus is only a medium strength planet. It is not a really strong planet that it would dominate and everything would be frou-frou, beautiful and pretty and Venus-like. He also doesn't fit into the picture of eccentricity or irregularity or strangeness that is associated with poets. The Venus does not impinge on the part of his character that has to do with the poetry. I'm saying Neptune does not impinge on the part of his character that has to do with poetry, and that's where the eerie, strange kind of poetry comes in. Now, we're looking at common ideas that we have about poets, so let's look at another. And that is, for male poets, women are supposed to be a source of inspiration. At least if you listen to everyone but Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde wrote, "You get as much inspiration from wet crackers as you do from a woman." but he was gay, so it's a little different. So in astrology, we've said it all along that Venus represents young women. And Venus in this horoscope then quite accurately describes the young women that he was attracted to, and it describes his interactions with them very well. His love nature, indicated by Venus, is rich and is substantial, and he was attracted to wealthy, substantial women. And central among them was a woman named Maud Gonne, Gonne, and she was a wealthy heiress. And when he met her, he was already an established poet, but he was still kind of innocent. He was an Irish poet, but not to the extent that he became later. Now, to appreciate what kind of a person she was in his life, we have to look at the Venus conjoined Pluto aspect. That aspect is not only the strongest aspect of Venus, it is the strongest aspect in the whole horoscope, so we expect that this is pretty significant. That conjunction of Venus and Pluto and the squares of both planets to Mars open us up to his desire nature and all the struggles that he had. Now, Pluto is a planet of influence, not direct action. The Godfather is symbolized by Pluto, and the Godfather never takes direct action. He influences others to take direct action, and he usually does so without even using any words. Inspiration is a form of influence, but certainly not all influence is inspiration. Maud Gonne was a tremendous influence on his life and even on his poetry, but she was not an inspiration. Like, he didn't write a lot of flowery poems to or about her. He did have feminine inspiration, but mostly in his youth and not much of that. Inspiration usually comes from Neptune or Uranus and sometimes even Jupiter. Inspiration does not usually come from Pluto. Beside being a planet of influence, Pluto is a planet of fascination. So we can see that he has love and emotional fascination, and that describes his emotions toward her. She introduced him to the Irish nationalist movement. And through the Irish nationalist movement, he became involved heavily in politics and even more heavily in Irish culture, and even more heavily than that into the Irish tradition of poetry. He was active on all levels in Ireland in things that were specifically Irish. Now, in his late childhood, he grew up in his mother's family, and they were very much Irish. And they talked about fairies and astrology and all of those kinds of things. So he had it in him. And so he was immersed in fairy lore and all of that. But when Maud Gonne came along, he was already a poet, but when he started thinking in terms of Irish nationalism and the Irish people standing for themselves, it opened his poetry up even more to things Irish. Pluto is a planet that deals with patriotism and nationalism and that kind of segregation. But Pluto represents things invisible. Not the things that are invisible until you see them with clairvoyance, like Neptunian things, but things that are always invisible. What Pluto represents, you will never, ever see. It's always invisible. A good deal of the power of Pluto is due to the fact that it is almost absolute in its subtlety and its invisibility. So, as this kind of power and influence in his life, she was something like what Beatrice was to Dante. And through looking at her and looking at the things that she introduced him to, he was raised to a higher level. Now, he didn't realize at first what the drawing power was from her. Now, he was acting from the youthful emotions of Venus. and Venus is in Taurus, and Taurus wants to possess. So he wanted to possess her. It's a mistake that many people make. They believe they can hold or own love, or if they hold someone else, they actually hold love itself. He proposed marriage to her a number of times. He kept on proposing marriage to her, and she always declined. And eventually she married another man who was in the Irish Republican movement. But the obsession didn't leave him. 25 or 26 years later, when he was in his 50s, he proposed marriage to her daughter. That was the result of the union from the first time. So he just, there was a fascination. It was a fascination that he couldn't get out of his consciousness. So we can see that in this Venus-Pluto emotionality, the squares to Mars do function as something that is repulsive. And it is an excellent case to study an obsessive-compulsive kind of behavior, which we will do. We may not get another chance for all of the horoscopes and all the times we're going to look at them. Obsession and compulsion begins with interest and attraction. In this case, she interests him. And she interests him in things that are semi-dormant in his unconscious. And they're things that are associated with people and all of the things that he had loved since childhood. And he seemed to love her for this, if for nothing else. Now, the Pluto component of attraction, as we have said, is fascination. He was fascinated with her because there was something invisible in her that he loved, and because she represented all those invisible things that he couldn't see, like fairies and things like that. And so he wants those things, and he wants to possess her. He wants her for his own. And the more he sees her, the more he realizes that he wants what is unseen. And that's what obsession is. With possessive love, he starts activating repulsion. No one wants to be owned by someone else, or if they do, they have their own kind of serious insecurity. And so she was not about to marry somebody who she could feel wanted to own her. Now, Pluto, as we know from Scorpio, is repellent, and it's repulsive all on its own. But it's infinitely subtle, and it's impossible to grasp. And any time you try to grasp it, it just enhances your awareness and your appreciation of all of that subtlety, and that increases its attractive desirability. So what we are describing here is a syndrome. You want something for some invisible reason, and when you try to get a hold of that invisible reason, you realize that it is invisible and that you can't get a hold of it, which makes it all the more desirable, and you keep going at it. Now, some poor people never give up. With obsessives, never give up, because they believe that the next time they're going to overpower the object of their fascination. If somebody is obsessive about food, or somebody is obsessive about drugs or something like that, they believe that the next time that they're going to do it, without realizing that the very fact that they're approaching things in the way that they're approaching them makes it absolutely impossible to do it. Now, fortunately, in this case, he has a lot of Gemini influences. And so as a consequence, he was able to adapt. And not only that, he had many alternatives, and he could distract himself, or he could substitute those things. And so he never really got completely bound up in his obsession. But even his biographers do admit that it was an obsession. When she got married, that helped things too, because it made things more definitely impossible. And when you realize that something is definitely impossible, it's much easier to deal with it. Nonetheless, it took quite a few years to temper his obsessive qualities. Now, when we looked at his personality, in that personality study, we spoke about his mystical inclinations and his inclinations toward fairies and things like that. They were from his mother's family. His mother was a fairly strong figure, and she was an heiress herself and was wealthy. When he grew up, he was therefore steeped in mysticism, and it helped him to establish his identity through his mother, because the moon is trine the sun and the self-identity is the sun. But in this too, he seems to have been somewhat extreme and reactive. Now, the moon by association, but not by orb, is opposite to Mars, which indicates something of a male-female struggle. And it indicates a struggle with the mother. This may have been only in his own inner consciousness and not an outward struggle, but it was there. Then you have the mild obsessive square between the moon and Pluto, which is another struggle with feminine power. And since it's usually a struggle with the mother, when the moon is involved, there's often guilt or something like that involved with it. So very often moon-Pluto afflictions are obsessions with cleanliness, because you're trying to cleanse yourself of your guilt because you have a problem with your mother, and you're not supposed to have a problem with your mother. In the case of Yeats, it was a very mild thing, and it was not so much with cleanliness, but with the appearances of things, which you might expect with the moon in the first house, which rules appearances. Any picture you see of him, even in casual circumstances, he's always very natty, and he's dressed appropriately for the occasion, and he has sort of an impeccable elegance about him. So Saturn is the strongest planet in the horoscope, and it forms only benefic aspects, and it comes from Libra, and so you can see that there is a positive side to keeping the appearances and for being impeccable. But with Pluto involved with the moon, there is also a mild obsession with all of this. So we can see from all of this that he had some kind of feel for things that were eternal, but somehow he felt in his not complete maturity of the emotional nature that was symbolized by obsessiveness, he felt the necessity to keep the forms of things rather than give himself over completely to eternity. He could never get as far as he wanted to get with mysticism. Now, the longer that I study mystical things and psychological things and astrological things, I'm convinced that there are conservancy principles that work in our soul nature, and that they are ways in which the unity of the spirit is maintained in our various inner bodies. One example of a conservancy principle is that when a person gets too extreme in one direction, what happens is the polar opposite principle starts to come into play. And that, that one extremity begets another is the way it has been said in history. In this case, there's another kind of conservancy principle, and that is we are attracted to what we are most ignorant or what we are most confused about. And in the case of Yeats, the thing that he was most ignorant about was the feminine. And that's carried out altogether because of the moon square to Venus. It's a mild aspect, but it shows that between a strong inherited mother and a strong inherited woman that he loves, he gets two different polarities in his consciousness, and he doesn't know which is the real woman. So this is something that these impressions on him reflect that the fact that he cannot unify the two different sides of emotional character. Now, he doesn't understand either of them, even if they're juxtaposed with each other. Now, if you look at this, at the chart that we have of the relative strengths of the planets, you'll see that the feminine planets are all of medium strength. They are 5th and 6th in strength. But the masculine planets, Mars and the Sun, are strong. So the mistake that he makes in his younger years is that he tries to use force or even obsessive power to overcome what he doesn't understand. Now, this means that there is struggle in him between his ignorance of the female and his very strong dominant appreciation of the emotional masculine, and the struggle that takes place between them. Now this, when he tries to apply force, we don't mean that he was a rapist or anything like that, but he thinks that by intellectual assertion, that in a masculine sense, that he's going to be able to understand the feminine. And if the very nature of the feminine is to withdraw and to attract and to receive, the stronger the assertion that you make, the stronger the feminine goes into its own nature, which is very different than the masculine. So this brings us to look at the Mars side of his emotionality. What we have been describing here is a mildly conflictive battle of the sexes. It's a historical theme. You read about it even in cartoons, in magazines, and things like that. Now, we're not saying that because he was involved with the battle of the sexes that he was bellicose with women or anything like that. He was obsessive about the power that they had because he realized that his obsession had power over him, even though he tried to overpower. That's one of the problems of obsessive characters. That happens. You recognize that something overpowers you every time, but you still are obsessed with overpowering it. Now, we're not saying that he was a sexist. We're not saying that he was a male sexist or a female sexist, because he was way too much of a humanist for that. He's got all these planets in the Aries signs. What we're saying, we're also not saying that he was derogatory toward women. He had way too much Saturnine respect for all human beings for that to take place. All we're saying is that there was a struggle, an active struggle between the 2 points of view, the masculine and feminine, within himself and to some extent in his relations with women in the outer world. Now, he obviously knew, since he knew about past lives and things like that, he knew that the spirit was the spirit, whether it was in a male body or a female body. So he knew that there was something much more at stake here than just overcoming one individual who is a female. Now, this emotional awareness of the conflict of the sexes is most indicated by the Venus square to Mars. Now, normally we associate that aspect with falling in love or falling into passion, which is correct. This is so because the emotional feminine is specialized, and in its specialization, it needs the emotional masculine, which it has sacrificed in order to become the specialist that it is. And vice versa, the emotional masculine needs the emotional feminine. So this is why there is almost an immediate attraction when there are Mars-Venus connections between charts, and especially if they are within the charts of the people who are being brought together. Now, the degree of attraction depends on the degree of ignorance that one has of the emotional opposite. Now, we've seen that Yeats, at least relative to his own character, is somewhat ignorant or in the dark about the feminine and about love. So, to that extent, he is someone that falls in love. Now, even though there is attraction between Mars and Venus, such that they need each other to be fulfilled, there's much more than that. Both planets are planets of active manifestation. That is, they activate the forces of attraction and repulsion. Their motivations are different, but they're still both activators. Now, it's too strong of a word to say that they were competitive motivators, because competition is associated with forces, but we really don't have a word in the English language to describe the competitive-like quality that you find between Mars and Venus. So that when there are Mars-Venus squares, there is something like a love competition. And if you look at people who are falling in love, it isn't just like there's smack attracted to each other and that's it. It is almost like Beatrice and Benedict in Shakespeare, that they're leading each other on, or they're pushing each other in different directions, and there is a kind of competitive-like quality in it. So even though there are positive interactions, there are struggles when there are squares and oppositions. This is something to watch for and observe when you get the opportunity. I'm at that age now where I love to observe the interactions of young people who are falling in love. It's, I don't know whether it's sentimental on my part or what. At any rate, in his poetry, he doesn't usually write directly about the battle of the sexes. In his poetry, he writes mostly about men, because that's where more of his consciousness is. We can see that it's a statement of his horoscope. And he considers men very important. But whether he's writing about men or whether he's writing about women, they are very distinctly different in their characterization. And it isn't only because they are of different genders. Some of his feminine portrayals are quite strong, and he carries out his obsessiveness even in his poems, in that when there are male-female interactions, the woman usually overcomes. When he does compare them or contrast them, the woman always comes out looking very good. And this is in spite of the fact of his martialness. Now I'm going to try and read one of his poems, which is very hard to read, and it's the most appropriate one I could find for what we're talking about. It is called On Woman. May God be praised for a woman that gives up all her mind. A man may find in no man a friendship of her kind, that covers all he has brought, as with her flesh and bone, nor quarrels with a thought, because it is not her own. See, he understands the feminine there quite well. Though pedantry denies, it's plain the Bible means that Solomon grew wise while talking with his queens. Yet never could, although they say he counted grass, count all their praises due when Sheba was his lass. When she the iron wrought, or when from the smithy fire it shuddered in the water, harshness of their desire that made them stretch and yawn, pleasure that comes with sleep, shudder that made them one. What else he give or keep, God grant me, no, not here, for I am not so bold to hope a thing so dear. Now I am growing old, but when the tale is true, the pestle of the moon that pounds up all anew brings me to birth again to find what once I had and know what once I have known until I am driven mad, sleep driven from my bed by tenderness and care, pity and aching head, gnashing of teeth, despair, and all because of some one perverse creature of chance, and live like Solomon that Sheba led a dance. That's a poem that pretty much describes everything we've been trying to say for the... It's interesting how much he knew himself and how he could put all of his struggles, objectively see them. You can get all of his own frenzy and all of his own struggle and all of that, but yet all of his own beliefs or all of his own experiences, and yet abstract them at the same time. The thing which is satisfying about working with a horoscope like this is that Yeats grew. He did perhaps apply force impetuously and certainly obsessively, but he learned. He did eventually have successful love affairs, and he had a successful marriage, and it only came after a long period of time. That edge of Mars had to be blunted by all of the obsessive futility. And after that had occurred, then he could fall in love, and then he could know things quite well. That's why this poem was written late in life. And you can see, that's again autobiographical in that way. So what he knew in mind and in spirit is very clearly shown in the poem, just as he eventually knew it in his own character and was able to bring it to pass in his desire nature. Now, everything we've been saying about this, about the Mars part of his desire nature, is true throughout his emotionality. He was an Irish nationalist, though he never fought. He was an intellectual, and he was an emotional person in the rebellion against Britain. And even his stance toward women was intellectual and emotional. It wasn't a physical kind of thing, because that was what his character was. The Mars, yes?
He couldn't have been too emotional, though, because he didn't have any planets in water.
Yeah, but that's in the written part. I'm trying to do two different things, one in the written part and one in the juicier part. I like doing the oral part. He wasn't excitable. He had emotions, but he wasn't excitable, would be the way you'd answer that in one sentence. He liked discipline. He has the Mars square Pluto, which is the aspect of discipline. And in his case, it was higher discipline. We all know that Scorpio, which is the home of Pluto, likes to control. And the square between Mars and Pluto is a first square, so it's a young square. And so this represents a youthfulness in this development or a part of his character. Trines usually are considered older aspects. They hold the promise of perfection that has been worked on for a long time, and if you continue it in this life, you can probably reach some degree of perfection. So we see that the moon trine to Saturn is probably an old talent, and it's a kind of control that has been perfected so that his emotions are very much in hand, whereas the Mars-Pluto control is still in that young stage, and there are all of those obsessive struggles with it. So it shows, the trine shows excellent control of emotions. It allows him to probe his feelings and to go very deeply into them. Now his poetry is usually measured. It's not radical. He doesn't jump to any conclusions, and he doesn't get too far off base. And that's probably because of the very strong Saturn in the midst of that four-planet grand trine with Sun, Moon, Uranus, and Saturn. And whereas the Venus Pluto and the Mars Pluto are weaker, but they're there and you can't doubt them. Now, in spiritual things or cosmic things, whatever is more receptive and takes form is called feminine, whereas the forces that inform and direct and control are said to be masculine. Things are accomplished in the cosmos when the masculine and feminine forces work together, especially if they work cooperatively and if they work in complement to each other. It's very rare that the two are ever balanced. In this horoscope, it's very obvious that the masculine qualities are stronger. Mars and Sun are the number 2 and 3 planets. And Saturn takes a masculine role by controlling in negation and containment in this horoscope. So we can say that the masculine in this horoscope has been brought to a high degree of development, even though the Mars part is a little bit immature. The more spiritual qualities of the solar masculine are in excellent shape. They're all involved with all those trines. There's a little opposition to Jupiter, but for the most part, the spiritual masculine is in great shape. But the emotional masculine, indicated by Mars, things are overdone. And as we've seen, they're overdone to obsessiveness. And it is the ignored emotional feminine, or the emotional feminine that he doesn't know, that is where all of the obsessiveness occurs. But he learns from his experience, both outside of himself and inside. Now, the square of Mars to Pluto is the epitome of emotional enthusiasm for the masculine quality of control. Mars-Pluto is the he-man aspect. It is the aspect that bodybuilders get carried away with. Now, Yeats was not a bodybuilder, though he did admire people who were tough, especially political figures who were tough and who persevered. He did try to win and hold women, but he didn't try to overpower them. In fact, it is poetic justice that when he did marry, his wife was a delicate medium whom he had to treat very tenderly. The Mars-Pluto desire qualities worked out in the intellectual sphere in another way, in the way he did things. His masculine love of control and the patriotism that went with it, the masculine qualities try to do things. They try to accomplish things. A masculine life is more linear. A feminine life is more circular. For a woman, it is nurture of the children, and it's the same cycle every day, and she's not out there conquering France or something like that, as the masculine would do. So for him, he admired the masculine quality of accomplishing things. And that patriotism and nationalism and this put together led him to espouse fascism. And the Mars-Pluto is a fascist aspect. He admired Mussolini because Mussolini shaped up the Italians who never seemed to amount to anything. And the Nazis who were coming up at the time got the trains running on schedule. You know, these were accomplishments. Now, his egalitarian qualities of thinking all equal in spirit did not allow him to maintain that attitude for long. But when he changed, he didn't change on his own. Mars is in the 7th house, and that indicates that the change had to come through the agency of another. And so during the heart of the Spanish Civil War, he met Pablo Neruda, who eventually was exiled from Spain and became a Chilean citizen, where he's almost worshipped like a god, and he was a Chilean citizen until he was killed by another fascist, by Augusto Pinochet. It's an interesting story. Pinochet sent his goons because Pablo Neruda was friends with Salvador Allende, and he was an outright leftist. And so he was an enemy of Pinochet, and so Pinochet sends the goons to Pablo Neruda's house, and they say, all right, they got him with the guns on him, and they say, where are your weapons? And Pablo Neruda points to the bookshelves. They didn't take the subtlety. They threw the books on the floor, and he died in torture a few weeks later. They took him into jail, tortured him to death. But at any rate, it was through the agency of Pablo Neruda that he became a Democrat, and that he became a believer in equality for everyone. When he did write poems about the Irish movement, he did like durable old men because he thought that in the strength of them was where the strength of democracy was to be found. So in this horoscope, we have to say that he's always living things on a higher level. Even though he was a fascist in mind and never in physical activity. And when he had his mind changed, it was always on that higher level. So he was a disciplined man, but he never carried his discipline so far that he got fetched with things like a mania for doing so many push-ups a day or something like that. So much of this coming to terms with himself in the desire world was because of the intellect. He was a very intellectual type of person. Now there's another aspect of the martial desire nature, and it is ironic, but he was inspired. But his inspiration did not come through women or even through the feminine. it was very masculine. And it is represented by Mars trine Neptune, which is a fairly strong aspect. And Mars is the emotional masculine, and Neptune is the spiritual masculine on the spiritual level. Now, he was friends and had discussions with Madame Blavatsky, and he became a member of the Theosophical Society and of the Golden Dawn. His wife was a mediumistic channeler, and the information that he put into his book called The Vision, which is a delightful book, came through her mediumistic activities. Now, although he was influenced by Blavatsky, and he held a very high regard and tenderness for his wife, neither of them would be called an inspiration in his life. His inspiration was probably primarily auto-induced. And if there was any inspiration in his life, it was probably Plotinus, because he wrote a large number of poems about Plotinus and Neoplatonism. And even the spirit that his wife channeled happened to be masculine. So he had this masculine quality, and he himself tried to practice magic and things of this nature. That's what the Golden Dawn was famous for. Again, he wanted application. But for him, the application turned out to be primarily intellectual and cultural, because there he was where he was functional. He was not capable of magic, but he was a very strong prayer, and he had other strong magnetic kinds of forces that he brought out from himself that he could inspire other people. Like all Platonists, he loved the idea of spiritual enthusiasm. But in most cases, he was the inspirer because his inspiration came from himself, and he was not inspired that much by other people. Now, an interesting thing that rounds out what we're trying to say is that it was because of this necessity that the imbalance that he was drawn to mediumistic women who were to some degree uncontrollably receptive. Now, because he didn't have a positive controlled receptivity in himself, at least not in the emotional nature, he developed the ability to be projective, and to be projective in an inspirational sense. But because he never did completely unfold the feminine, he could never unfold clairvoyance, and that was of great sadness to him. But at least he had learned the lessons on the desire or emotional level. If one wants to make any progress of any kind spiritually, it's impossible to do so without having a balance between the masculine and the feminine on the spiritual and emotional levels, because the energy that rises up the spine rises on both sides of the spine, and one side is masculine and one side is feminine, and unless that energy is brought up in a balanced way, it is impossible for one to unfold any kind of spirituality. But the same thing that happened to Yeats is something that has to work in us. If we are not working sufficiently on the feminine, we will be drawn into feminine situations until we realize that that is the case. Now, when we say these things, we can't say that he was completely unbalanced in his emotional nature. We have to temper all of this, and we have to synthesize and put it all together, because he was obviously, in some parts of his emotional nature, very well balanced. And that, if we look, for example, at the Saturnine part, which Saturn's position in this horoscope with its relationship to the moon, You could call that selective discrimination for specific ends. That is, he could get a feel of the world and he could control his feelings and his receptivity of the moon through Saturn, but always for specific ends because Saturn is always specific. Saturn in Libra represents balance, a very special kind of balance that we call equipoise. And the grand trine of Saturn with the moon, sun, and Uranus, we've mentioned that before, indicates that it was a deliberate, self-conscious application of poise. Saturn is the strongest planet in the horoscope. And it forms only sextiles and trines. Thus you can say that he, in a very deliberate, graceful way, knew how to eliminate anything that was not to his end or to the specific end that he was looking for. That we see both through the trine and indirectly we see through the rulership of the ascendant, which is co-ruled by Saturn and Uranus. So what's coming in and what's going out is very carefully controlled by Saturn, who as the gatekeeper of Aquarius was called the doorman to the realm of chaos. Saturn is the ultimate gatekeeper. So we can say that he's deliberate, and he's very deliberate, and it holds the feeling nature in a receptive state, not an excited state, not at all. It's open, but it's not an excitable emotionality. So he had to have Saturn put it in that kind of a place. The air signs are signs of neutrality and of impartiality. So he does this, or it is his nature in this part of the emotionality to be as impartial as he can, which is necessary for doing poetic work. Libra is a very tasteful sign, so we can see that the character of his feelings has a classy quality about it. Saturn in Libra is very elegant and classy. The trine, or the first part of the trine, is in expressive houses. That is, the sun, moon, and Uranus are in the first and fifth houses, which, as we've seen before, are expressive houses. And so he wishes to express his feelings. But Saturn is in the eighth house, and Saturn represents the end of all things. It is in the repulsive emotionality, the thing that we segregate or separate to reach that particular end. In his case, it is not selfish, it is unselfish, but it's saying like his emotional control and his selectivity is not overt. It's not obvious. He wanted to work or see things from behind the scenes. So he's a cool discriminator. What this seems to indicate is that his discrimination is for the purpose of getting the feel of hidden things, which brings us right back to that fascination again, only in this case it's understood by intuition and it's the invisibility, it's not a lost invisibility. So the eighth house Saturn and the Uranus being in the grand trine represent an objective, a desire world objective to know the secrets of things, and that is the reason he discriminates anything that is not part of that secret. The part of the emotionality that is predominant and is the part that is the most well developed. That is the part that is most obvious and most people would see. Most people would see him as a cool type of individual. The obsessive part of the emotionality where he had to do most of his work, is not something that everybody saw. And it seems very likely that his success in this is that he stuck with the fundamentals, but at the same time did not stick with them obsessively, but only long enough so that he could see through them and see the futility of things. Will he be born as a woman again? His poem says no. He wants to be born as a man the next time around again, but I suspect that he learned enough in this life to move forward and flip over. And that's all I have to offer. These are the written parts. Any questions?
Yeah, could Venus conjunct Pluto square Mars in a chart also possibly, in a different chart, possibly indicate some kind of abuse?
Yes, abuse or rape or anything like that, yes.
Because I know of somebody that has that configuration.
Yeah.
And there was abusive, her father was abusive,
Yep.
and her first husband was abusive.
Yep, yep, very clearly so. He was lucky to work things out on a different level. Any other questions? Geez, an easy night.
I guess I have another comment.
Yeah,
I've noticed in a particular chart, actually with one of my kids, who has Saturn transit, and she has an unaspected Saturn in the chart, and she had some Saturn square transits, and they turned out to be very, very positive.
mm-hmm.
Even though, like for a lot of people, when you have Saturn squares, it's very, it creates a lot of tension and
Yes.
stress. But she was able to straighten out her life with the Saturn transits. Do you find that, is that common or?
Yes. Some people, it's what it sounds like is sometimes there's a statement. It's usually in very amateur athletic contests. People will go into a huddle, people that are losing, and they say, "We got to get serious." And sometimes you don't put forth your best and change your life until things make you realize how serious it is. And a Saturn affliction like that would be a matter of helping you to get serious about life.
Yeah, like she's back in school now, and she studies all the time, and she's really diligent. She has a Mercury opposite Jupiter, and Saturn, first squared Jupiter, and then it squared Mercury, and she's
Yeah.
really diligent.
Yeah,
She never was before.
yeah, yeah.
Do you feel that in that kind of case, that sometimes the testing aspects of Saturn would turn out to be in the long run more beneficial than, say, a trine or
It has to be, or it wouldn't be in the cosmos at all. Though some people do succumb, and under trials they seem to fail miserably, but even the miserable failure is a step forward. But it has, if we weren't supposed to have trials and we were just supposed to sail through life like we were walking through a dress rehearsal or something like that, we wouldn't have them. But it is the trials that do it.